Have you ever had this feeling when you talk about something in some languages, everything feels very clear in your mind, you know exactly what you want to say, and you even feel your logic is quite smooth. But the moment you switch to English, the other person's reaction becomes, huh? I can't understand what you mean, but somehow it sounds strange. The reason is actually very simple. You don't understand how English expressive logic works. So naturally, real communication problems happen. And you can't really blame yourself because chances are the English courses you learned before were never designed around expressive logic. In other words, no one seriously trained you in one thing. When you see a sentence, are you expressing cause and effect, a conclusion, a comparison, or a logical result? So slowly, a very common situation forms. Everything is clear in your head, but once you translate it into English, both sides feel frustrated. If you really want to get rid of this awkward feeling, you must watch this video carefully until the end. Next, I will use 6 examples to clearly explain the completely different logic systems between some languages and English. For example, think about this. You want to say something happened last year. One company was in some sort of crisis, then they finally decided to let 300 people go. How would you say it in English in one sentence? I guess most people would say, this company fired 300 people last year. When native speakers hear this, they feel something familiar but strange at the same time because English usually doesn't express this in this way. And I'll explain why in the first example. The 6 situations were not chosen randomly. They come from my 26 years of teaching experience, summarizing the fundamental logic differences between English and many other native languages. Once you master these 6 situations, you can avoid about 90% of the logic traps that most learners fall into. At the end, you can also leave a comment and tell me which logic difference you found most interesting. Before we continue, let me quickly explain why I'm qualified to talk about this. I majored in English in college. I've worked in English education for 26 years, teaching hundreds of thousands of learners, many of whom now study at universities in a lot of countries. Just a few days ago, I was teaching a TOEFL student who was 12 years old, and I discovered later on that his mother is my student many years ago. That moment really moved me. And if this is your first time on my channel, and you want to improve your real-life English communication skills, especially listening and speaking, make sure to subscribe. In this video, I'll deeply analyze 6 real situations where English and many native language logic work in completely different ways. After watching, you'll clearly understand the 6 logic gaps that trap most learners, and you'll be able to avoid the expressions that sound awkward to native speakers. At the same time, I've prepared a free summary PDF that includes all the key points for you. The download link is in the description below. Now, let's begin this fascinating logic journey. First, let me answer the question from the beginning of the video. Why is it that everything feels very clear in your head in some languages, but once you say it in English, the other person feels confused? Most people will give a very simple and a rough explanation. Oh, a lot of non-native speakers just don't have a good logic. You may have heard this, you may have even doubted yourself at some point, but this explanation is actually lazy and irresponsible. Why? Because if people lack logic were true, it could not explain at least the 3 things. First, many people who are said to sound illogical in English make highly rational decisions every day in their own professional fields, like engineering, scientific research, business decisions. If their logic were really poor, they simply couldn't function in those areas. Second, when these same people speak their native languages, almost no one says, oh, your logic doesn't make sense. People may disagree with their opinions, but rarely say, I don't understand what you're saying. Third, logic doesn't suddenly disappear just because you switch to another language, right? So the real problem is definitely not, whether you can think clearly. The real problem is when you speak English, you don't express the thinking process itself. Let me give you a clear conclusion first. Some languages and English work in completely different ways when it comes to expressive logic. Let's not talk about, which one is more advanced. Let's focus on one key point: how much each language allows logic to be hidden. Well, the truth is, some languages are high context languages, such as Chinese. What does that mean? It means that when you speak, part of your logic is assumed to exist in shared background, in shared experience, and the idea that you understand me and I understand you. So with some languages, you can, one, give the conclusion first. Two, skip the middle reasoning. Third, and the listener will automatically fill in the gaps. And this kind of expression is efficient, natural, and completely acceptable in some languages. But English works in the opposite way. English is a low context language. It places a very strict demand on the speaker. I can't and I won't guess your logic. If you don't say it, I assume you didn't think it through. If you don't make relations clear, I don't know whether you're talking about one, cause and effect, two, logical reasoning, third, or just listing information. So in English, cause must be clear, contrast must be clear, reasoning must be clear, logic must be built into sentences structure. And this is exactly where the problem appears. Most learners do have logic in their minds, but what comes out of their mouth is only the result. And English is exactly the kind of language that feels uncomfortable when you jump straight to the conclusions. So when native speakers listen to you, they don't think you're wrong. What they feel is something much more subtle but serious. I roughly understand your point, but I don't know how you get to that kind of conclusion. And that feeling is what people describe as your English sounds illogical. Now, let me use 6 practical situations to show you the logic differences between some native languages and English. One, why does English use the passive voice so frequently, while many other native languages use it much less? Many learners have this feeling. Why does English keep using passive sentences all the time? In many native languages, passive voices is indeed not used that often. But behind this is a completely different logic focus. Let's first look at very common sentence in some languages. Last year, this company laid off 300 people. This sentence is grammatically correct, but in real English usage, it sounds like you're deliberately emphasizing who did the action, which is the company. However, native speakers naturally prefer to say 300 people were laid off last year. You can see a big shift here. Some languages focus on what the company did, while English focuses on what happened as a result. That's the difference. The focus moves from the doer to the event itself. Now, look at a more everyday example. Many learners say things like, oh, the repairman fixed my phone. But native speakers almost always say, my phone has been fixed. Because in English, the truly important information is that the phone is working now, not who repaired it, right? Another real-life situation, some learners say stuff like, oh, someone stole my wallet. But in natural English, people usually say, my wallet was stolen or my wallet got stolen. Because again, the speaker's focus is on the result, the wallet, not on some vague person who was a thief, actually. This is one of the biggest logical differences between some languages, and English. Some languages simply, one, find a person to be the subject. Two, talk about who did what. English, however, one, put the most important information in the subject position. Two, whoever or whatever is most important becomes the subject. 3. Unimportant actors can disappear. That's why English uses passive voices so often. Some languages are person-centered in subjects. English is information-centered in subjects. Whoever carries the key information stands at the beginning of a sentence. And this is exactly why many non-native expressions sound strange. It's not because the grammar is wrong, it's because the focus is in the wrong place. You are emphasizing who did the action, while native speakers, care more about what happened. Let's start with a sentence that almost every learner has said before. This plan isn't very good. The time is not enough. In some languages, this sentence is completely natural. No one would think your logic is broken. But when native speakers hear this, a question immediately appears in their minds. What is the relationship between these two sentences? Is it the plan is bad because there isn't enough time, which is cause and effect, or the plan itself is bad and time is just another separate problem? Parallel information. Notice something important here. Native speakers are not saying you're wrong. What they're really saying is, I don't know how you moved from A to B. And English, as a language, really dislikes missing steps. So it forces you to make the relationship explicit. The natural English expression is, this plan doesn't work because we don't have enough time. See, what English truly requires is the relationship must be clearly spoken. That word because, extremely important here. It tells the listener exactly what you mean instead of forcing them to guess. Let's move to another very common situation. This is one of the places where learners are most often told that their English is jumping in logic. In some languages, this plan won't work. This is a completely normal judgment sentence. No one finds it strange, but when you say directly into English, the first reaction of native speaker is, why? Why? They're not disagreeing with you. They're simply thinking, you didn't explain your basis, for your judgment. In some languages, you can assume we all know what happened before, but in English, a conclusion without a source is not trusted. So the more natural English expressions are, given these constraints, this plan won't work, or that's why this plan isn't feasible. What English really wants is not just the conclusion. It wants to know, what is the conclusion based on? See, that's the huge difference. This example is extremely important because it directly explains why your English can sound unprofessional in some languages. In some languages, I feel this idea is not very realistic. There's nothing wrong with this sentence. In some languages, it sounds completely natural, but when you say this in English, I think this idea is unrealistic. Native speakers will subconsciously feel you're expressing a personal opinion, not an objective judgment. This doesn't mean you can never use I think. The point is, English usually expects you to give the reasoning conditions. So the more professional sounding English would be, given the current constraints, this idea isn't realistic. Did you notice something? English doesn't like you stepping forward to say, I think. It prefers you to lay out the conditions first. That's the difference again. This example is especially powerful because it explains why many learners' English sounds empty. In some languages, this plan is better. The listener will automatically complete the meaning better than the previous one. But when you say directly in English, like this plan is better, native speakers immediately pause and think, better than what? In English, comparison relationships cannot be guessed. They must be clearly stated. So you have to say, this plan is better than the previous option, or this approach works better in this situation. What English wants is not just better, it requires the comparison target to appear. See, that's the difference. This final example is extremely real because it explains why many learners are told your argument feels jumpy. In some languages, so this won't work. This sounds like a perfectly natural closing sentence. But when you say directly in English, so this won't work, native speakers feel something strange immediately. Where did this so come from? Because in English, so is not just a filler word, it's a logical signal. It tells the listener, I've already clearly explained the cause and effect relationship. If you haven't explained that relationship first, this so here feels sudden and confusing. So the more natural English expression would be because of these limitations. This won't work. See? Very different. At this point, many of you probably already feel something inside. It seems no one ever taught me these things before. And you're right. This is not your fault, because most English learning processes were never designed around expressive logic. Think about your past learning experience. What were you trained to focus on? Vocabulary size, grammatical correctness, pronunciation accuracy, whether sentences sound smooth. But almost no one seriously trains you in one thing. When you speak, what kind of logical relationship are you expressing? Are you showing cause and effect, reasoning and inference, a comparison, or a conclusion? So slowly, a very common state forms. Everything is clear in your mind. You know exactly what you want to say, but when you speak, only the result comes out, not the process. And English is exactly the kind of language that assumes if you only gives the result, you probably haven't thought it through. This is why many learners feel a very strong frustration that they can't quite explain. Oh, I understand everything, so why does it sound wrong when I speak English? Once the problem is here, the solution becomes very clear. Real English improvement is not about learning more vocabulary or drilling more grammar. It's about training one core ability, turning the logical relationships in your mind into sentence structures in English. You need to learn not just how do I say this sentence, but what kind of judgment am I making right now? Is it, because A happened, B followed? 2, under these conditions, the conclusion is C. 3, compared with X, this option works better for Y. Based on current information, I can only infer this much. When you start organizing your language this way, something important happens. Your English may suddenly feel slower, but at the same time, much more stable. At this stage, you are no longer just forcing sentences together, you are building logical structure. And English is, by nature, a structure-first language. So now, let's make the final conclusion completely clear. English is not more logical than some languages. No! Yeah, no. It simply does not allow logic to be hidden. Some languages, such as Chinese, allow omissions. English refuses unexplained omissions. That's the difference. Some languages assume shared understanding. English assumes I know nothing unless you say it. And this is exactly why so many learners struggle. The real problem was never, I can't think logically. The real problem was, I was never trained to clearly express my thinking process. Once you realize this, your entire understanding of English will shift. You'll stop asking, am I bad at language? Am I just not good at English? And you will start asking a much more powerful question. Did I put the logic into my sentence? And here's the real advantage for non-native speakers. Everybody listen to this. Native speakers grew up using English naturally, so they rarely learn these logical structures consciously. But you can train them deliberately. So when you learn to express logic clearly, you often become more structured and precise than native speakers, trust me. You don't just speak English. You think in structured English. That's very different. This is where non-native learners can truly outperform. To summarize, because English and some languages developed differently, they tolerate very different logic, habits, and expression. Once you understand this, you can avoid most of the expressions that sound strange in English. I've organized all the key points from this video into a free PDF document for you. The download link is in the description below. I've already compressed everything into a clear and a practical summary. You're also welcome to check out other videos on my channel. Some focuses on learning strategies, and others focus on real language usage. I believe you'll absolutely find them helpful. If this video helped you, please make sure to like it, share it, and save it. Thank you so much for watching, and I guess I'll see you in the next one.